The wind rolled gently across the wide Montana plains, brushing against the tall grass like an old song. The air carried the scent of rain-soaked earth, wild sage, and distant pine, familiar, comforting scents that reminded Jeb Carter of how long he'd been alone. He stood by the white fence of his ranch, one boot propped on the lower rail, eyes scanning the horizon the way he always did at sundown. The Carter ranch stretched for miles, thousands of acres of green and gold under an endless sky, but to him, it often felt like a desert. Jeb wasn't just known for the size of his land or the fortune that came with it. Folks in town called him the richest man in the county, but wealth didn't mean much to a man who'd lost everything that made it worth having. 8 years had passed since his wife, Clara, had died. 8 years of empty suppers, of walking past her rocking chair by the fire and pretending he didn't see the way it still swayed when the wind pushed through the windows. He'd filled his days with work, fixing fences, breeding horses, running cattle. Nights were quieter, lonelier. The house creaked in its silence, and the old piano in the corner stayed untouched. He sometimes caught himself talking to Clara's photograph when the storms rolled in, asking if she could still see him. That afternoon, the sky was heavy and gray. Thunder mumbled in the distance, promising rain. Jeb had just finished checking the south fence when he heard something, a faint sound carried on the wind. At first, he thought it was a calf lost in the brush. But as he turned toward the sound, he realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was crying. Frowning, he followed the noise past the gate, his boots squelching in the damp dirt. The crying grew clearer, softer but desperate. Then he saw them, 2 little girls, no older than 7 or 8, huddled near a ditch. Their dresses were thin and torn, their bare feet smeared with mud. One of them clutched a threadbare stuffed rabbit to her chest, while the other held her sister's hand tightly, as if afraid the wind might carry her away. Jeb stopped in his tracks. He hadn't seen children up close in years. His voice came out rough, more from surprise than anything. "Hey there," he called gently. "You girls lost?" The smaller one lifted her face. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, her lip trembling. "No, sir," she whispered. We came here for you." Jeb blinked. "For me?" The older girl nodded. She had the same eyes as her sister, wide and a little too old for her age. "Mama said you're the richest man round here. She said you got a good heart." Something inside Jeb twisted. "Your mama, huh, where is she now?" The girls exchanged a look, the kind that needed no words. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. The smaller one finally answered in a voice barely more than a breath. "She went to heaven last night." Jeb's breath caught. He felt the sting behind his eyes and turned his face toward the rain that had just begun to fall, hiding the emotion that cracked through his chest. He'd seen loss before, but hearing it in the voice of a child, it cut different. The older girl took a shaky step closer. "We didn't know where else to go. Mama said if anything ever happened, we should find you. She said you'd know what to do." Jeb crouched down slowly, his weathered hands resting on his knees. Up close, he could see how thin they were, how their tiny shoulders shivered under the gray sky. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lila," the older one said. She pointed to her sister. "This is June." "Lila and June," he repeated softly, the names rolling off his tongue like something precious. "Well, Lila and June, I reckon you did a brave thing coming all the way out here." Lila bit her lip. "Please, mister," she said, her voice cracking. "Just be our daddy for today. We promise we won't bother you after." Jeb stared at them, 2 little souls standing in the rain, asking for something no child should ever have to beg for. The memory of Clara's last words rose like a whisper in his heart. "Don't shut the world out, Jeb. You still have love left to give." He didn't know how to answer at first. He wasn't a man of words anymore. But something deep inside him, a part of him he thought had died, stirred to life. "Well," he said, clearing his throat and standing tall again. "I reckon I can do that." He knelt once more, scooping both girls into his arms. They were light as feathers, their tiny arms wrapping around his neck. The rain came harder now, soaking them through, but for the first time in years, Jeb Carter didn't feel the cold. He carried them through the fence, across the yard, and toward the warm light glowing through the ranch house windows. And though he didn't say it out loud, he knew in his heart, it wouldn't just be for today. The storm outside roared against the windows, but inside the Carter ranch house, warmth flickered back to life. Jeb had never imagined his quiet home, once filled only with the echo of his boots and the creak of old floorboards, would sound like this again. The crackle of fire, the soft rustle of quilt fabric, and 2 little voices whispering to each other under the blanket filled the air like a long-forgotten melody. He stood in the kitchen, his hands shaking slightly as he poured steaming cocoa into 2 chipped mugs. The smell of chocolate drifted through the room. He wasn't sure if he even remembered the recipe right, it had been years since he'd made it for anyone but himself, but when he handed the mugs to the twins, their eyes lit up like Christmas lights. "Careful, it's hot," he said, his gruff tone softened by the sight of their smiles. June, the smaller one, blew on the cocoa before taking a sip. Her eyes widened in delight. "It's good, real good." Lila nodded politely, cupping her mug in both hands as if afraid it might disappear. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. Just Jeb'll do," he said. "No need for formalities." He sat across from them, leaning back in the creaky chair that had always felt too big for one person. Now, with 2 small figures across the table, it finally felt right again. "So," he began, "your mama told you to find me?" Lila hesitated, looking at her sister before answering. "She said, if she couldn't make it, we should come here. She said you helped people before." Jeb's chest tightened. "What was your mama's name?" "Annie Mae Walker," Lila said quietly. He froze. He remembered her well. Annie Mae had worked on his ranch almost a decade ago, strong, kind, and with a smile that could ease the worst day. She'd been there the summer Clara got sick. She'd helped care for his wife in those final weeks, staying up nights to read Bible verses aloud when Jeb couldn't bring himself to. Then, after the funeral, Annie Mae had left. No word, no letter. Just gone. Now her daughters sat in his kitchen, the spitting image of her. Jeb cleared his throat. "Your mama was a good woman." Lila nodded, her eyes glistening. "She was the best." A long silence followed. The twins stared into their mugs, their small shoulders trembling. Finally, June's voice broke the quiet. "Mama said we had to leave 'cause of the man in town." Jeb's brow furrowed. "What man?" "The landlord," Lila whispered. "He said we owed him money. Mama got sick and couldn't work, and he got mad. He said if we didn't pay, he'd sell us to somebody." Her lips quivered as she tried to finish. Jeb's blood turned to ice. "Sell you," he repeated, his voice low and sharp. June nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "We hid all night. Then Mama said we had to go find you before he came back. She told us to follow the river, that it would lead to your land." Jeb clenched his fists under the table. Rage burned inside him, not the wild kind that made a man foolish, but the kind that simmered deep and cold. He'd dealt with cruel men before, but this was beyond cruelty. He stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said firmly. "You hear me? You're safe here. No one's ever gonna lay a hand on you while I'm still breathin'." June sniffled, and Lila looked up at him with cautious hope. "Promise." He knelt down so their eyes met. "Promise," he said, his voice breaking. Lila nodded slowly, and for the first time, she let herself lean against him. June followed, resting her head on his shoulder. Jeb held them both, feeling their tiny hearts beating fast against his chest. It had been years since he'd held anyone that close. That night, after they'd eaten the soup he'd managed to make, watery but warm, Jeb tucked them into the old guest room. The quilts were faded, and the wallpaper had peeled a little at the edges, but the girls didn't seem to care. They curled up together under the covers, their hands clasped tightly. He stood in the doorway long after they'd fallen asleep, the firelight casting soft shadows on their faces. They looked peaceful now, safe, for the first time in who knew how long. Jeb's eyes lingered on the small stuffed rabbit sitting between them. He remembered Clara once saying, "A home ain't a home without laughter in it." Maybe, he thought, this house could become one again. When he finally turned away, he whispered into the quiet, "Rest easy, Annie Mae. I'll take care of 'em." Outside, the storm began to fade. The thunder rolled away into the mountains, leaving behind only the sound of rain against the window. The ranch was still and calm once more, but for the first time in 8 long years, Jeb Carter didn't feel alone. Morning came softly over the plains, spilling gold light through the wide ranch windows. The storm had passed, leaving the world fresh and glistening. Puddles sparkled like bits of glass across the yard, and the mountains in the distance looked washed clean by the rain. Inside the Carter Ranch house, the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the kitchen. Jeb stood at the stove, a spatula in one hand and a grin he hadn't worn in years tugging at the corner of his mouth. He could hear the twins giggling down the hall, the sweet, innocent sound of childhood that made the old house come alive. "June, stop it," came Lila's voice, followed by a burst of laughter and the sound of small feet racing over the creaky wooden floor. A moment later, they came bounding into the kitchen, June with her hair sticking up like hay, and Lila trying to fix the ribbons that had come undone in the night. They froze when they saw the table. Jeb had set it himself, pancakes stacked high, scrambled eggs steaming, and a small jar of honey from his beehives. 2 glasses of milk sat waiting. June's eyes widened. "You made all this?" He shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Well, a man can't let 2 guests go hungry, can he?" Lila's smile was small but full of light. "Mama used to make pancakes like this. But hers always came out burned." Jeb chuckled. "Then I reckon I did better than I thought." They sat down together, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Jeb Carter shared breakfast with family. The sound of forks clinking, the chatter, the laughter, it felt like something precious he'd forgotten how much he missed. After breakfast, he took them outside. The air was crisp, the sky bright and endless. The girls ran ahead, squealing at the sight of the horses grazing in the field. "Can we ride one?" June asked, her little boots sinking into the wet grass. Jeb rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, maybe a short ride. But only if you promise not to fall off." Lila's face lit up. "We promise." He led them to the gentlest horse in the barn, an old mare named Daisy. She'd been with him since Clara was alive, calm and patient. He lifted June onto the saddle first, steadying her small hands on the reins. Lila climbed up behind her, holding on tight. "All right," Jeb said, giving Daisy's flank a soft pat. "Let's take her nice and slow." The mare began to walk, her hooves squelching softly in the mud. The twins' laughter rang across the pasture, pure and bright. Jeb walked alongside, keeping a hand on the bridle, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in years, joy. Real, living joy. When they were done, he helped them down, and June threw her arms around his waist without hesitation. "You're the best daddy ever," she said, grinning up at him. The word daddy hit him like a lightning bolt, sharp, unexpected, and warm. He felt his throat tighten, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Lila stood quietly beside him, watching. Then, softly, she asked, "If you're our daddy for today, can we call you Daddy Jeb?" He looked down at her, at the hope trembling in those brown eyes that looked so much like Annie Mae's, and something in him broke open. He smiled through the ache. "You can call me whatever you want, sweetheart." The rest of the day passed in a blur of sunlight and laughter. They helped him feed the chickens, brushed Daisy's mane, and even baked a lopsided apple pie that somehow ended up more flour than filling. The girls insisted on setting the table themselves for dinner, and though plates clattered and spoons dropped, Jeb couldn't stop smiling. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, the twins grew quiet. The sky turned orange and violet, and the wind whispered through the trees. They sat by the fireplace again, cocoa in hand, their eyes sleepy but thoughtful. "Daddy Jeb," June murmured, her voice soft. "We know today's over." He looked at her, heart heavy already. "But, can we come back tomorrow?" she asked, eyes shining. "Just for one more day." Jeb didn't answer right away. He felt something rise in his chest, something fierce and protective. These girls weren't just guests. They weren't just Annie Mae's daughters. Somewhere between sunrise and sunset, they'd become his family. He knelt in front of them, his rough hands taking their tiny ones. "You don't need to ask again," he said, voice low but full of promise. "You're home now, both of you." Lila gasped. "Really?" He smiled, his eyes damp but steady. "Really?" They burst into tears and threw their arms around his neck. He held them close, feeling their little hearts beating against his chest, and for the first time in 8 years, Jeb Carter didn't feel like a broken man anymore. Outside, the sky turned dark and clear, stars spilling across the heavens like diamonds scattered on velvet. The old ranch no longer felt empty, it breathed again, alive with laughter, warmth, and love. And as he tucked the girls into bed that night, Jeb whispered to the heavens, "Thank you, Clara. Thank you for sendin' them to me. Because sometimes, family didn't come by blood. Sometimes, it came in the form of 2 lost little girls who asked a lonely man to be their daddy for just one day, and ended up giving him back his heart forever."